There's new research on how mothers in the workforce are penalized for having children. Joya Misra of the UMass School of Public Policy and Sociology outlined that research in a paper titled Motherhood Penalty, the wage gap between women with kids and those without. I spoke with her about that research, how the United States fares compared to other countries on this issue, not well, and whether new laws might help reverse this disparity.
The United States is really exceptional in its lack of support for families with children. So we do have a few things. We have the earned income tax credit that families with children receive, but there are many other policies that other countries have. So like family allowances, payments to families with children, universal child care. So the same thing that we have for K through 12 in terms of public schooling is available in most countries for children below 6 or below 5.
And even before that, paid leave, right, for new parents?
And even before that. So paid leave started getting adopted in the very early years of the 20th century. So around 1904, 1908, a lot of countries put paid leaves in place. By now, pretty much every country except for 4 really poor countries in the U.S. Have a paid parental leave.
So most, just to recap what you just said, most industrialized countries except for the United States, have some form of paid leave for their parents.
Well, that's the thing. What's interesting about it is it's not just that most industrialized countries, but most countries have maternity leave. So poor, rich, all over the world, everybody sort of supports the idea of maternity leave. The U.S. is very exceptional, and we do have FMLA, which provides
Family
parents...
Medical Leave Act, right?
Family Medical Leave Act, which allows parents to take off some time around the birth of a child. But because it's unpaid, many families can't afford to take the leave.
Right. So what that leave does is protect your job, essentially, so that it's there when you decide to come back, if I understand it correctly,
exactly,
right?
Exactly.
So in your research, which you co-authored with some other folks, you use this phrase, the motherhood penalty. Where does that phrase come from?
The motherhood penalty, it's been used by different researchers probably since the late 90s. So I think either Michelle Budig and Paula England or Jane Waldfogel actually coined the term. And it's been used to show that there's this consistent penalty that mothers appear to pay in the labor market, that they are paid less than childless women who have all of their other same characteristics.
And some of those characteristics include what? Education, and so give us some of the specifics.
Education and job experience, what kinds of jobs they're in.
So really on paper, they would be comparable. If the employer didn't know that they had a child, they'd look kind of the same, right?
Exactly. And there are even there's a really interesting audit study, an experimental study that Shelley Carell did, where she sends resumes to employers, and on some of the resumes they say that the person is involved in a community organization, and some they say a parent guardian organization in a school. And then she looks to see which ones get callbacks and what is the recommended salary. And it's so interesting because the men who look on paper like their fathers are more likely to be called back and are more likely to get higher wages offered to them. And the ones that look like their mothers on paper are less likely to get called back and are offered lower wages. So even there, they're just looking at the paper. There's no other difference that they could possibly be observing. Motherhood seems to carry a penalty.
So in your recent paper, you looked at 3 periods of time. So we're not even talking about, 40 years ago this was the case. You looked at 1986 to 1985, 1996 to 2004, and 2006 to 2014. Overarching, and we'll talk about specifics in a minute, but overarching, what did you find?
Well, what we hope to find, what we would have liked to find, is that because over that same time period, women have really increased their experience, so they've been spending more time in the labor force, and they've increased their education, so women are very highly educated these days in the U.S.
To your earlier point, they look better on paper.
They look better on paper today than they did maybe in the mid-'80s. And so what we hoped to find was that motherhood penalty had reduced over this time period. And we could say, we've really made progress on this. Employers are treating women sort of equally, whether they're parents or not.
But what you actually found was?
What we found was that the penalty has remained pretty much stable over that time period. So it really hasn't changed over time. And
more than 30 years. There hasn't been a significant amount of change here.
Despite the fact that we know, but we've seen enormous change in women's labor force participation, their education, their experience, like all of the things that should be affecting wages.
Something that you said in the report, I want to quote. It says, the report says, there remain stubborn differences in pay between childless women and mothers. And more specifically, you found that women who have one child versus women who don't have a child, there's a difference there. What's the pay gap among that group?
Well, it depends a little bit on the time period, but we could sort of say that there's about a 13% pay difference between.
So someone with a woman with one child is going to make 13% less than someone who is comparably educated but just does not have a child.
Exactly.
Do you know why that is?
Well, the research can't tell us really that much about why that is. We definitely tried to suss out, we used different statistical techniques to try to suss out whether there was something going on, like, for example, mothers with one child are just less motivated. The data doesn't seem to suggest that. It really does seem like there's a penalty there.
And so in continuing with the research, when you looked at mothers who have maybe 2 or more children, difference there, right, when compared to a woman who's childless who's working. What's that difference?
So that becomes more like a 17% difference. So it definitely increases the more children that people have. And that's like just rock solid, stable over this entire time period from the 80s through the teens.
So they're being penalized more if they have more children, or
yes.
less?
Yes, for the most part, you're penalized more the more children you have. And the way we modeled it was to think about, okay, well, there are mothers with one child, mothers with 2 children, mothers with 3 or more children. Another way people model it sometimes is to do it just as number of children. And what they usually find is there's somewhere between a 4 and 7% effect for each child.
Wow. And so I know that you've looked at this research over a period of years too, and you've also compared it, as we said, to other countries. In terms of pay, what do we know about that, the United States versus other countries?
Well, the wonderful thing about this is that there actually seems to be a solution to the problem. So in countries that have adopted policies that really support working parents, and really all working parents, including parental leaves for fathers and mothers, including child care availability that's subsidized by the government, so it becomes sort of like the educational system. In those countries, we really have seen the motherhood penalty drop off. There's a great study that's based on data in Norway that shows that over the same time period that we were looking for the U.S., the motherhood penalty disappeared. So it was there at the beginning, but it really disappeared. And it's, certainly mothers have really focused on making sure that they have the skills that they need to do well in the workforce.
Meaning they're better educated, or they've taken other steps to make themselves a stronger candidate.
Exactly. So I think women have absolutely done what they can, but the Norwegian data and data from other countries seems to suggest that if the government steps in and provides that little bit more of support for working parents, then we'll see these pay gaps disappear.
Is there any sense that best practices, say from Norway, are being looked at by anyone here to say, hey, here's a potential legislative solution for this problem?
I think that there is increasing interest in these kinds of policies. So as far back as the 1990s, there were states who started adopting some pre-K programs that were oriented toward 4-year-olds and even 3-year-olds. And those were states that really realized that they needed to get in on the beginning of this, because it's actually something business owners like too. It has all sorts of positive outcomes for children and education if you sort of start them with education a little bit earlier. So those were some moves that happened then. In recent years, the moves have been more at the state level around paid leave. So a number of states have now adopted paid leave, either using unemployment insurance or other kinds of mechanisms to make sure that people can take a maternity leave or a paternity leave around the birth or an adoption of a child, and support them to maintain their ties to the workforce. And like in a place like California that has the paid leave, we again are seeing much better outcomes for mothers.
And it seems really here in the United States, at least for the short term, that employers are sometimes taking the lead, whether that's Netflix that we hear about, they're offering a year of paid leave, or Facebook. Were you surprised to see that employers who are in one way sort of holding these women back by not paying them equal wages? But here we have other employers who are saying, you know what, here, let's give you a year of paid leave.
And it's really interesting because employers in part are using these policies to attract the best workers. They want a diverse workforce. They want a workforce that, women put a lot of time and effort into their education. They don't want to invest in workers and then have them disappear because there aren't supports in place when their children are very young. So I think employers identified, hey, this was a great solution for us. And it's really interesting, like in California where there's a paid leave, the employers that already had leaves that they paid for their workers are much more likely to inform their workers of the state leave, because the state leave means that they pay less.
Wow.
So middle-class workers are more likely to take advantage of it.
One more quick question. This came up a lot in the presidential campaign, this concept of paid leave. Are you seeing a shift in the cultural landscape around this larger discussion of paying women in the female mothers in the workforce?
I think so. I think that because there are so many more families with working parents, both fathers and mothers, it's just been an enormous shift in public opinion, and people really think that this is the right thing to do, the right way to go. I really expect that we'll see in the next decade and a half, a pretty substantial shift in the U.S.